Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Humanitas lecture series sponsored by ISD, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. It's always good to welcome Natalia here. And this is the series on statecraft and diplomacy. And it's a great honour and privilege to be able to introduce Gareth Evans for today, and for two more lectures and then a symposium. The second lecture will be on Friday the 10th in this room, and the third lecture on Monday the 13th, followed by a symposium on Tuesday the 14th of May, which is in the afternoon. And if you'd like to come to the symposium, do go on the Crash website and sign up. There's some fabulous speakers, and it's going to be a really interesting occasion. And I'm going to say no more except to turn over Professor Hill, who will introduce our distinguished speaker.
Thank you very much, Simon. It's also an honour and a privilege for me to be able to introduce Professor Gareth Evans to you. I think anyone who has followed contemporary international relations, that is, say, last 20 years or so, who's read any international relations scholarship, will know quite a lot about Gareth Evans already. There is a small club of distinguished scholar practitioners who are as comfortable with the academic literature as they are with the practice of diplomacy. And Gareth Evans is right at the top of that list. In fact, I learned that he was elected by Foreign Policy magazine in December 2011 one of the top 100 global thinkers for, quote, making the responsibility to protect more than academic, to which my response is only the top 100, really. This is not good enough, I would say. The top one or two, frankly, certainly on the responsibility to protect. Gareth, if I may use his first name, has first-class honours in PPE from Oxford and law from Melbourne. He's been Australian Foreign Minister for a long period. He's been in the Australian Parliament for 21 years, I think. He's written or edited 9 books and 100 articles. But he is best known in the wider world for having made a strenuous effort to introduce the idea, or certainly to disseminate it, of the responsibility to protect, which has developed out of ideas about humanitarian intervention to try to square the circle of a world of sovereign states and a commitment to the needs of peoples, individuals and collective, and to give them some security. And in fact, he's also well known for inventing and publicising the idea of cooperative security. As Australian Foreign Minister, he also originated the idea of the good international citizen, about which thinkers like Andrew Linklater have written further. So he's really got a tremendous repertoire, and we're very much looking forward to his triad of lectures. The first of them is today, Ending Deadly Conflict, a Naive Dream, and you will see from the title that he is doing what has needed doing regularly, that is to say, providing what I would call a meliorist answer to the realist. The realists always accuse anyone who wants actually to improve the world of naivety, and they need to have a fairly informed and robust response on a regular basis, because realism gets in everywhere, especially in the world of practice. Perhaps academics are too much characterised by meliorism, but we will hear from Gareth about the balance in all this. He's going to lecture, actually it's Simon wasn't quite right, a lecture on Friday is in room 1, but also in the Mill Lane lecture room, and the third lecture is on Monday in room 2. But anyway, in this complex. The second will be on the question of mass atrocity crimes. You've all seen the handout, I'm sure. And the third on the question of eliminating nuclear weapons, another subject which Gareth has been involved in high-level commissions. He was, as you probably know, part of the Secretary-General's high-level panel which reported on a more secure world in 2004. Didn't manage to unblock the question of Security Council membership, unfortunately, but made lots of other important contributions. Anyway, I'm so glad to be able to chair this session, and looking forward very much to your remarks, Gareth. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Chris Hill, for that very warm and generous introduction, which I just hope to God I can live up to. Thank you, Simon Goldhill, and to Crash for sponsoring this Humanitas visiting professorship with help from Natalia Bulgakova in London. Thanks to the German sponsor of all this, Angelika Dickman, who's not here but has made it all financially possible. And thanks very much to Richard Dielab and everyone else at Pembroke for so warmly hosting me and my wife during our stay here in Cambridge. So I'm really very honoured to be giving these lectures and really do appreciate the kindness, the generosity, and indeed, given both the speaker and the topic, the bravery of everyone involved in inviting me to give these talks. I say that about this topic, the general topic of in defence of optimism, because, of course, to be an optimist about anything in international affairs is to run the risk of being branded ignorant, incorrigibly naive, or outright demented. And to remain an optimist, a glass half full kind of a person, after 25 years of treading the boards as a national foreign minister, as an international NGO head, I ran the International Crisis Group for 10 years, and as a participant, as Chris has indicated, in various other commissions and campaigns trying to influence international policy making, I guess that will be thought to be by many to be evidence of a mind simply incapable of learning from experience. But I do remain a tenacious believer in our capacity to learn something from the past and not to repeat its most awful mistakes. So in these Humanitas lectures, I will argue that this has been clearly demonstrated, first in the context of deadly conflict generally, the subject of today's lecture, second in the more specific context of genocide and other mass atrocity crimes, the subject of Friday's lecture, and in the third lecture I'll suggest that it's also been demonstrated, sort of, in the progress that we're making toward eliminating nuclear weapons, although much more problematically here because movement has of course been really very slow. I also have a belief based on my own experience, which I'll spell out later in today's lecture, that distinguishing between the instinctive optimists and instinctive pessimists of this world is actually a rather more productive way of understanding the way in which real-world policymakers actually react to peace and security issues than trying to enrol them in any of the familiar international relations theory schools of realism or liberalism or constructivism and all their innumerable variants. No doubt in taking this unashamedly simplistic view, I'll be setting myself up for a very heavy counter-assault in the half-day scholarly symposium which will follow this lecture series. But as the lawyers among you might remember, as Lord Denning used to say in court, contemplating the prospect of finding himself alone in dissent yet again, I must face that consequence with such fortitude as I can command. So there we go. If we were hoping for peace in our time, the last year, like so many years before, has certainly not delivered it. Conflict has grown ever bloodier in Syria. It's continued to grind on in Afghanistan. It flared up periodically in West Central East Africa. There were multiple episodes of ethnic, sectarian and politically motivated violence in Myanmar, Burma, South Asia, around the Middle East. Tensions between China and its neighbours have erupted in the South China Sea and between China and Japan in the East China Sea. Concerns obviously about North Korea's and Iran's nuclear programs and behaviour remain unresolved. As we read each day's newspapers and look at each night's television news, as we think about everything that's going wrong in the world and start listing all the impossibly difficult issues with which the Security Council is currently wrestling, it really is quite hard to believe that ending deadly conflict once and for all could be anything more than an impossibly naive dream. And if your taste is for gloom, there are plenty of other ways of compounding it. There's a great deal of published psychology research which plays into the argument that there's something endemic and irreducible about the human instinct to violence. One of my favourite examples is a University College London study 10 years ago showing just how easy it is for violence to rapidly escalate from very small beginnings.
Sorry, Gareth.
The mic seems to have gone off.
Go on, can people hear at the back?
I'm sure you can hear me, but
somebody's coming to try and speak to you.
Okay. Well, if you can hear, I'll plough on, or is that going to muck up your recording?
That's fine, just carry on.
Okay. As I was saying, one of my favourite examples of this apparently endemic and irreducible human instinct to violence is the University College London study, which shows about how easy it is to escalate from small beginnings. The experiment involved measured pressure being applied to volunteers' fingers, and then they are asked to apply exactly the same amount of pressure to their partners across the table, with their partners then responding in turn. The typical response was 40% more force delivered than actually experienced, with the result that within a couple of minutes, what began as a game of soft touches quickly moved to moderate pokes and eventually some hard prods. So each partner believed that the other was escalating. Neither realised that what was really involved here was a neurological quirk by which the pain we receive almost invariably seems worse than the pain we deliver. Then there was a very long series of research findings stretching back over 40 years, which were very conveniently summarised in a 2006 foreign policy article called Why Hawks Win, which suggests that when it comes to the basic psychological impulses that are at work when issues of war and peace are involved, there are built-in biases which do incline decision makers to make at least 4 basic errors. First, we exaggerate the evil intentions of adversaries. Even when people are aware of constraints on the other side's behaviour, they tend not to factor that in when assessing the other's motives, while at the same time assuming that the other side fully understands the constraints on one's own behaviour. Second, we're overly optimistic when assessing the case for going to war in any of these situations. A large majority of people believe themselves not only to be more attractive than others, but more talented and smarter than others, what Garrison Keillor would call the Lake Wobegon syndrome, which commonly leads them to overestimate the amount of control over outcomes that they're associated with. Thirdly, we're unduly pessimistic when evaluating the chances of peace. There's a reluctance to accept concessions from the other side on the intuition that they must be worth less simply because the other side has offered them. And fourth, of course, and I think we're all familiar with this, is a deeply embedded reluctance to cut losses, even when the risks of further loss by going on are very high, which clearly helps many conflicts to endure long before the point at which they should stop. So it really doesn't need much imagination to see how these various factors might conceivably have had more than a little bit to do with the various policy mistakes and roadblocks with which we're all too unhappily familiar in the context of escalating and intractable conflicts like Syria, just as we can see most of them clearly recurring in the conflicts of decades and centuries past. So again, it certainly requires a considerable feat of optimism to believe that these kinds of reflex reactions buried deep in the human psyche, not to mention all the rest of the mental furniture that plays a part in human conflict, including hatred, intolerance, greed, are ever going to be able to be sufficiently neutralised. But there is something going on out there. There is an accumulation of data about what's actually happening in the real world of deadly conflict between and within states that does give us some real ground for optimism that hoping for an end once and for all to such conflict might not be an impossibly naive delusion. What's now being described generally as the new peace phenomenon was first publicised by the Human Security Report Project, which is a team of scholars in Canada working under the direction of former UN policy advisor Professor Andrew Mack, supported in particular by the superb database of the Uppsala Conflict Data Program. And what their figures demonstrate, quite contrary to conventional wisdom, and perhaps to the instincts of all of us who think we follow international news pretty closely, is that over the last 2 decades, major wars and episodes of mass violence worldwide have become much less frequent and much less deadly. After a high point in the late 80s and early 90s, there's been a decline of well over 50% in the number of major conflicts, both between and within states, in the number of genocides and other mass atrocities perpetrated, and in the number of people killed as a result of them. This bigger story is simply being concealed as ever by the media's daily preoccupation with current bloodshed. The decrease in the number of battle deaths has been particularly striking, whereas most years from the 1940s through to the 1990s had over 100,000 such reported deaths, and sometimes as many as 500,000 or more. The average for the first years of this new century has been less than a third of that, averaging around 30,000, which is, on any view, a very dramatic trend decline. Of course, violent deaths in battle are only a small part of the whole story of the misery of war, and a great many war-related deaths are indirect due to disease and malnutrition rather than direct violence, as we've seen, for example, in the Congo, Darfur. And these can certainly sometimes substantially exceed direct battle-related deaths. But some of the most familiar, publicised and alarming calculations, in particular for the Congo, do seem to have been inflated by quite challengeable statistical assumptions. And certainly there seems to be no foundation at all for the very commonly made claim, that most of you probably heard, that the overall ratio of civilian to military deaths has increased over the course of the last century from around 10% to 90%. That's simply not true. The detailed analysis of the Human Security Project, while not for a moment downplaying the immensity of the collateral suffering that's always associated with every war ever waged, does suggest that indirect deaths of non-combatants have in fact declined to an even greater degree than violent deaths related to combat. There have been a number of efforts made to debunk this generally optimistic analysis of the conflict environment, but frankly I don't find any of them persuasive. True, there has been now documented something of a resurgence since 2004 of what statisticians, if not humanitarians, would call minor conflicts, minor armed conflicts. And there's also been a worrying increase in another subset in recent years of internal conflicts that have been made more bloody by external power involvement, as in Afghanistan, Iraq, in Congo, and I guess we now have to say Syria as well, taking into account the increasing flood of externally supplied arms now sustaining that conflict. But if you look at the overall figures on the most significant conflicts, high-intensity conflicts, or wars properly so called, which are defined in most of the literature as entailing 1,000 or more battle deaths in any given year, the trend line really has been sloping unequivocally downward for the last 60 years, all the way back through the peaks, which have been lower each time, of the Korean War in the 1950s, the Vietnam War in the 1970s, the Iran-Iraq and the Afghanistan wars in the 1980s, and certainly since the end of the Cold War. This new peace phenomenon is reinforced by a second phenomenon that historians now call the long peace, the unprecedentedly long period in which there have been no wars at all between the great or the major powers. Since 1945, not only did the long-feared confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union never erupt, but no interstate wars at all have been fought between the major developed countries, nor have there been any wars at all in at least Western Europe, in contrast to what's been calculated as the average of 2 new conflicts a year in Western Europe, right back through the last 6 centuries. That mic's gone off again. Look, the crucial question is why all this is happening. Is it just a statistical quirk? Again. Is it just a statistical quirk from which deadly business is bound to resume as usual, sooner or later? Or are there real causal factors which can be identified, which between them can give us some real confidence that despite all the ups and downs and despite the individual crises and conflicts that continue to haunt us, the world has actually passed a turning point and really is getting safer and saner? To focus first on the new peace phenomenon and exploring this question of why, the evident dramatic decline in conflict generally the new peace phenomenon, which is this evident dramatic decline between and within states over the last 20 years. A number of factors have manifestly contributed to that, including, of course, the end of the era of colonialism, which generated actually 2/3 or more of all wars from the 1950s to the 1980s, and the end of the Cold War itself, which meant, among other things, no more proxy wars being fuelled by Washington or Moscow, and also eventually the end of the road for a number of authoritarian governments which were propped up by either side, which had been provoking internal resistance. But as has been, I think, again formidably argued by Andrew Mack and his team in the Human Security Report project, the best explanation is really the one that stares us in the face, even if a great many people don't want to acknowledge it. And that's simply the huge upsurge in activity in conflict prevention, conflict management, negotiated peacemaking, and post-conflict peace building that has occurred over the last decade and a half. Most of that has been spearheaded by the much maligned United Nations, although there's also been a great deal of additional input from governmental and some other non-governmental organisations, including, I would claim, my own International Crisis Group, from its very small beginnings in 1995. We are doing better for a start at diplomatic peacemaking, whereas in the Cold War years, more wars were decided on the battlefield than ended in negotiation. In subsequent years, successes from Cambodia to the Balkans to Northern Ireland to West Africa to Nepal to Aceh have well outnumbered what remain so far the failures of diplomatic peacemaking, among which we have to, of course, number places like Sri Lanka, Darfur, and now Syria, although hopefully yesterday's announcement coming out of the Lavrov Kerry meetings in Moscow about a possible diplomatic conference by the end of this month will be at last the diplomatic breakthrough we've all been hoping for. Recent Uppsala figures do show that the number of new peace agreements has actually been falling in recent times, which may mean that the low-hanging fruit has been plucked and the wars that persist are now more intractable, but it could simply be a consequence of there being now fewer wars to make peace about. And while it is the case that as many as 1/3 of all peace agreements do break down in less than 5 years, we can't carry our optimism too far, the evidence is that when wars do recur in these circumstances, they're on average some 80% less deadly than the first time around. So for all these reasons, peacemaking effort really does seem to be worth it. Similarly, when it comes to peacekeeping, we're becoming ever more professional at this. The Security Council currently mandates 15 peacekeeping operations, missions around the world, with over 110,000 international military, police and civilians deployed. And peacekeeping goes on evolving to meet new needs, the most recent example being the mandating in March this year, which got a full-page report in The Guardian I saw over the weekend, of an intervention brigade, so-called, within the larger peacekeeping force in the Congo, which has been explicitly tasked in a quite unprecedented way to mount offensive and not just reactive operations against those continuing to perpetrate violence in the Congo. And we're certainly doing much better at post-conflict peace building, having finally learned after the horrendous experiences of Angola and Rwanda and Afghanistan and Haiti that the best single predictor of future conflict is past conflict in that same place, and that there really is an absolutely critical need to put in sustained resources and commitment during the years that follow peace agreements to stop the whole horrible cycle of violence starting again. There's been another major development over the last 20 years which has changed the dynamics in favour of peace, namely the emergence of an effective system of international criminal law designed to overcome the sense of impunity from justice that so many warmongers and perpetrators of mass atrocity crimes in particular have enjoyed for so long. There have been specialist national courts created with international assistance, like those in Sierra Leone and Cambodia. There's been special tribunals to deal with war crimes committed in specific conflicts, in particular Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia. And by far most importantly, of course, there's been the establishment of the International Criminal Court as a permanent court now to hear cases of genocide, crimes against humanity and war crimes, with no time limitation on its ability to prosecute. While there's been some criticism of, among other things, the slow pace at which many of these proceedings have moved, all these courts have now delivered convictions. And the message is certainly getting out to warlords and warmongers that things aren't quite what they used to be. Another factor in reducing the overall level of violence in the world, until recently quite under-noticed and under-documented, has been the rise in the level of effective, organised, non-violent resistance. There's a fascinating recent book just published by Chenoweth and Stephan, which documents how over the course of the last century, campaigns of non-violent resistance have actually been twice as effective as their violent counterparts in winning regime change. And of course, every struggle that's resolved by such resistance is one that doesn't enter the database of armed conflict at all. The remaining factor, which I think helps to explain the decline in violent conflict, is in fact the other big global good news story, namely the dramatic and increasingly rapid decline in world poverty, not least in Africa, which has been documented most recently in the 2013 UN Human Development Report, which makes the point that, and I quote, "Never in history have the living conditions and prospects of so many people changed so dramatically and so fast." Now, while there's never been a simple correlation between poverty and conflict, it is certainly possible to argue that as incomes rise, states become better capable of addressing grievances, both peacefully and more robustly, and that the opportunity cost of joining rebellions quite dramatically increases. It's one thing to be unemployed and living on the margins of existence. It's quite another to have a job, a house, and prospects. In addition to all these institutional, political, economic explanations of the new peace, there's another important normative factor which does come into the equation, and that was mentioned by Chris Hill in his introduction, the quite dramatic way in which the world is now thinking and acting about mass atrocity crimes, genocide, ethnic cleansing, and other major crimes against humanity and war crimes, which are either threatened or occurring within state boundaries. The story of the emergence and embrace of this new concept of the responsibility to protect, and its likely future after the midlife crisis, I think it's now fair to say it's currently experiencing in Syria, is a story that I'll be seeking to tell in the second lecture in this series on Friday. When we turn to the long peace between the great powers, and indeed the dramatic decline in interstate conflict generally, it's perhaps even more likely, although very hard to prove, that normative developments, changes in mindsets, the way in which policymakers and those who influence them think about these issues, it's arguable that these have been really quite centrally important. A credible argument can certainly be made that the decades since the end of the Second World War have seen the effective disappearance after many centuries of flourishing life of what the French call bellicism, the ideology seeing virtue and nobility in war, and its replacement by the perception that with today's technology, the damage inflicted by any war would be unbelievably horrific and far outweighing, in today's economically interdependent world, any conceivable benefit to be derived. Steven Pinker, the Harvard psychologist who's just published in the last year, a really quite brilliant book documenting the decline in violence over not just recent decades but the whole course of human history. It's called The Better Angels of Our Nature, and it's well worth reading. He puts it this way, and I'll read the passage because it's quite entrancing. He says, "Norms among the influential constituencies in developed countries may well have evolved to incorporate the conviction that war is inherently immoral because of its costs to human well-being, and that it can be justified only on the rare occasions when it's certain to prevent even greater costs to human well-being. If so, interstate war among developed countries would be going the way of customs such as slavery, serfdom, breaking on the wheel, disemboweling, bear baiting, cat burning, heretic burning, witch drowning, thief hanging, public executions, the display of rotting corpses on gibbets, duelling, debtors' prisons, flogging, keel hauling, and other practices that passed from the unexceptionable to the controversial to the immoral to the unthinkable. Well, maybe this is far too optimistic a reading of where the world is now at, but it's certainly worth thinking about. Also worth thinking about and reinforcing my general disposition to be a little bit more optimistic about the underlying currents in human nature than some people think rational. Well, I don't want to spend too much time on this, is the Princeton historian David Canadine's very recently published book, just a few days ago, The Undivided Past, which is based on his Trevelyan lectures given here at Cambridge a few years ago, which book argues that the great signifiers of otherness, religion, nation, class, gender, race, civilization, have never in fact been unbridgeable divides. That the whole course of human history, which he reviews, has been at least as much about cooperation as conflict, and as much about kindness to strangers as about obsession with separate identity. And that there is a sense of common humanity that continues to bind us together. Well, read it and see if you're persuaded. Returning to the long peace issue, a more conventional and certainly a more sceptical explanation than anything to do with human nature, evolving or otherwise, is that this has really been a nuclear peace, simply the product of nuclear terror between the United States and the Soviet Union throughout the Cold War, and a balance maintained since then between the other potential pairs of belligerents, including India and Pakistan, India and China, China and the United States. But while it's hard to argue that nuclear deterrence played no part at all in keeping the peace, at the very least it must have made policymakers more cautious, I think there's very good reason to think that its role during the whole Cold War period and beyond has been very much exaggerated. I'll develop these themes in the third lecture of this series, but some of the relevant arguments are these. First, that the existence of weapons of mass destruction, including chemical and bacteriological weapons, before 1939 has not stopped wars between major powers in the past. Second, that the wars which have taken place since 1945 have quite often seen a non-nuclear armed state, apparently unmoved by its rival's capability in this respect, either provoking or failing to surrender to a nuclear armed one, as with North Korea and Vietnam and Iraq against the United States, as with Vietnam against China, as with Afghanistan against the Soviet Union, as with, dare I say, Argentina against the UK. Another argument here is that the existence of nuclear weapons on both sides has not stopped and may even be seen to have encouraged a number of instances of military adventurism by one nuclear-armed state against another, most notably recently in this respect Pakistan's Kargil incursion against India in 1999. Though I have to say this one does cut both ways. On the one hand, it certainly does suggest that nuclear weapons on both sides are no guarantor of peace and security between potential belligerents. But on the other hand, it certainly doesn't stop nuclear deterrence enthusiasts saying that the only reason that the adventurism in question did not lead to a full-scale war, and stayed a relatively minor one, was because of a fear on both sides of a nuclear holocaust. I think the real story in all of this, and the best way of explaining some of these apparent inconsistencies, may again be the normative one. In this case, the existence of a profound international taboo against the deliberate use of nuclear weapons, at least in circumstances where the very survival of the state is not immediately in jeopardy. Since the early 1950s, when it began to sink in that their destructive capacity really was infinitely greater than anything previously seen, such deliberate use has really been seen as inconceivable by the leaders of any country thinking of itself as civilized and wanting to be thought so by others. Presidents Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy rejected military advice to use nuclear weapons in the Korean War, the Taiwan Straits crisis, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the force of that taboo has, if anything, grown since. Even John Foster Dulles said that if the United States had used nuclear weapons in Korea or Vietnam or against China over Taiwan, quote, we'd be finished as far as present-day world opinion was concerned. There has been some very recent published research suggesting, I find a little alarmingly, as I find a lot of research that comes out of the United States testing public opinion there, but suggesting that the nuclear taboo is nowadays not felt as strongly as previously thought by the US public. But among policymakers worldwide, whatever might be the case with their publics, it's my own personal instinct, and I still talk to a lot of these people around the world, it's my own instinct that the taboo among policymakers and those who advise and influence them is as strong as ever. And it's confidence in the existence of that taboo and the effective unusability of nuclear weapons that goes with it that may be thought to explain why so many military risks have been taken over the years in defiance of that supposed deterrent. None of this means for a moment that we should be comfortable with the existence of nuclear weapons. In short, so long as any nuclear weapons are retained by anyone, the risk is all too real of stumbling into a nuclear exchange through accident, miscalculation, system error, or sabotage. And any such exchange would be potentially catastrophic for life on this planet as we know it. But that's all for the third lecture. Although, of course, that's if someone turns up to the third lecture, and I note in this respect the triumph of expectation over hope in the diminishing size of the lecture theatres that have been identified for these three lectures. But moving on, we'll see how we go. 9 down to 2 down to 1. But anyway,
they're all fairly silent.
Yes, yeah, okay. For all the better news that I've been describing and seeking to explain, there is absolutely no room for complacency that either the new peace or the long peace will be self-sustaining, without much further effort to further strengthen international institutions and norms in support of sustainable peace. Whenever one feels the urge to such complacency, it's always useful to think back to Norman Angel's grand illusion prophecy in 1909 that the integration of the European economies was so complete that war was impossible. Or maybe to recall Viscount Cecil speaking at the League of Nations in September 1931, just a week before Japan invaded Manchuria, when he said, quote, "I do not believe there is anyone in this room who will contradict me when I say that there has scarcely been a period in the world's history when war seemed less likely than it does at present." One crucial priority in this respect is to take far more effective action than the world has taken so far to eliminate the risks associated with the use and misuse of nuclear weapons. So that's on our agenda. Another priority, which I'll talk about, as I've said at some length in my second lecture, is to re-establish consensus at the highest Security Council level about the way in which we react to the worst and most urgent mass atrocity crimes, and in this context particularly to develop agreed criteria for the use of coercive military force in dealing with atrocity crimes. But I think the biggest priority of all, and I can't do more now than sketch this with a very broad brush, must be to embed once and for all into the consciousness of the world's policymakers that there really is simply no substitute for totally embracing a cooperative approach to maintaining global peace and security. It's simply not possible to respond effectively to security threats, whether global or regional, or in many cases even local, and whether they come from state actors or non-state actors, without effective international cooperation. Whether on early warning and intelligence, on effective preventive strategies, on conflict management and response strategies, or in post-conflict reconstruction. There are limitations on any country's capacity to do anything without allies or friends or supporters, or by extension, working through international and intergovernmental institutions, starting with the UN. It's in every country's national interest, not just small or medium-sized countries like my own, to operate in a rule-based rather than a raw power-based international order, to be seen to be, if you like, a good international citizen. And it's in no country's interest to try to achieve or maintain a position of unrivaled regional or global dominance. One opportunity to make a giant stride in this direction was, I'm afraid, comprehensively lost in the aftermath of the Cold War, when, although they toyed with the idea, the United States and its European allies, and to some extent Russia itself, could not ultimately manage intellectually or emotionally to embrace the idea of including Russia in a new cooperative mechanism to prevent and settle conflict in the post-bipolar era. The problem with NATO's expansion was never that it extended to Russia's borders, it was that it stopped there. There'll be many new tests for cooperative security in the years ahead, not least in the Middle East, but the greatest, unquestionably, is how China and the United States react to the dramatic shift which is now occurring in their relative economic and eventually military power. As to how China will behave, one of the very best analyses I've actually seen describing possible external scenarios for China over the next decade is that given recently at the Brookings Institution by Kevin Rudd, Australia's Mandarin-speaking former Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, and now unhappy living proof of the reality to which I can also testify that Australian politics is indeed a bloody and dangerous trade. But Rudd's scenarios for China ranged from actively pursuing zero-sum power politics aimed at dominating the hemisphere and beyond, through to engaging strategically with the US and other partners in Asia to sustain and enhance the existing rules-based international order. And while suggesting that it would be prudent for countries to hedge against the worst-case scenario, Rudd made clear that he's an optimist. He said so very specifically. And I think he's right. Provided the rest of the world maintains a policy of cooperative engagement with China, President Xi Jinping and his team, I think, are quite likely to choose a non-confrontational path. But how will the United States respond? President Barack Obama's re-election does offer, I think, reasonable hope that the US will give some strategic space to China through a policy of mutually accommodating cooperation. But the loudly heralded military pivot to Asia and much continuing rhetoric of the dominance and primacy kind that we hear still coming out of Washington suggests to me that this is a relationship which could end in tears unless very carefully handled indeed. The best expression I've ever heard of the US mindset required to avoid things ending in tears was something said by Bill Clinton in actually a private gathering I attended in Los Angeles in October 2002 after he'd left the presidency and acquired all the wisdom that comes with hindsight. Unfortunately, I haven't seen this written down anywhere else subsequently, but it seems to me to capture just perfectly what's required, and let's hold our breath seeing whether it will happen. What Clinton said was this, vividly remember it. He said the United States has two choices about how we, the US, use the great and overwhelming military and economic power that we now possess. We can try to use that power to stay top dog on the global bloc in perpetuity. Or we can use it to create a world in which we will be comfortable living when we are no longer top dog on the global bloc. I think that's a pitch-perfect statement of the mindsets required, whether Obama or anybody else is capable of either articulating or undertaking the behaviour that follows from that remains very much to be seen. There's one further thing I want to talk about before I conclude. In watching over the years how policymakers talk and act on international peace and security issues, and in trying to gauge how they think, and contemplating how I've thought and talked and acted myself in different practitioner roles, it really is a matter of enduring mystery to me how little of it seems to have anything to do with the preoccupations and prescriptions of international relations theory. Practitioners very rarely talk in terms of any of the familiar academic school labels, and even more rarely act consistently with any of them. There are some academic writers, and Christopher Hill here in Cambridge has an honourable place among them, who've consistently tried to bridge the gap between international relations theory and foreign policy practice. But for the most part, these do seem to inhabit separate universes. Part of the problem for non-aficionados is to understand exactly what the traditional theory labels mean. Well, it's not hard to grasp or to see the point of the oldest and most familiar distinction in international relations theory, that between realists and idealists. This seems to be regarded by theorists these days as really quite kindergarten stuff. You can forget about a job in any Western international relations department anywhere unless you can confidently draw out the distinctions between classical, post-classical, neo, defensive and offensive realists, and on the other side between idealists and liberals, and then between a miscellany of neo and institutional and other hyphened subspecies of the latter. Then cutting across all that, as some of you who are suffering all this as undergraduates will be well aware, is the division between constructivists at one end of the scale, who are primarily moved by the notion that norms and ideas really matter, and rationalists who are not so persuaded. And beyond that, out in a sort of a space all their own, are a miscellany of postmodernist and other related world views of varying degrees of impenetrability, which my late and dear friend Tony Jutt sweepingly, but I suspect not entirely unfairly, described as narcissistic obscurantism. The only theory schools which seem to me to get at all close to describing the way in which practitioners actually think and behave are those which are rather more inclusive or even eclectic in their embrace. One such, I should say in deference to both my current location and its continued high standing, is the English school, largely populated, as Chris points out, by Australians and Canadians, but the English school nonetheless, which might be described as sort of liberal realism with a dash of constructivism thrown in. But even more multifaceted is the recently established new school that I was delighted to come across, called analytical eclecticism, which seems to me at first sight to be an admirable home for those intellectually sluggish and disreputable types like me, who are too academically ill-disciplined and ignorant to fit in anywhere else. But the trouble with all these labels, with the possible exception of the last, is that none of them really credibly describe the way in which those of us in this business actually behave, year in, year out, in all those situations where some kind of policy choices are open to us. Even the most adventurous of us, and most passionately committed to human rights and universal values and norms, know that in the real world that crowds in upon us, good ideas and values sometimes carry the day, but often they don't. Realities constantly intrude. Compromises constantly have to be made. I certainly felt these competing pressures very sharply during my own foreign ministerial career. I was hugely committed throughout to human rights ideals and multilateral institutions, and I know I pushed my diplomats' tolerance to the limits, requiring them, among other things, to make endless representations in Beijing and other unreceptive places against executions and in support of amnesty, prisoners of conscience and so on, and in making various quixotic efforts to reform UN personnel and institutional practices, to restructure the Security Council and so on. But I also engaged in plenty of what would clearly be described as hard-nosed realism, not least in the boundary negotiations I conducted with Indonesia over the Timor Sea, or the peace negotiations in which I was involved with the Khmer Rouge. It is certainly discomforting in the extreme, let me tell you, to sit across a table from genocidaire, as I did in those Cambodian negotiations, and generating howls of indignation from the John Pilgers of this world as a result. But engaging with those for some or all of whose behaviour you feel the utmost distaste is not the same, of course, as endorsing that behaviour. And without being able to draw that distinction, diplomacy, and with it any kind of capacity to maintain stability in international relations and to find solutions to problems and conflict, would simply grind to a halt. One of the most interesting treatments I've seen of the way theory relates to practice in international policy making was an article in International Security a few years ago entitled "The Future of US-China Relations, Is Conflict Inevitable?" by the Princeton academic Aaron Friedberg, who I'm pleased to be able to report, in the interests of my analytical objectivity, did a stint on the dark side as President Cheney's planning advisor during the George W. Bush administration. But taking as his starting point the three main camps in contemporary international relations, theorising, realism, liberalism and constructivism, he argues that what really matters most in determining their adherents' attitudes and prescriptions at least on the China-US issue, is a more fundamental cross-cutting division between optimists and pessimists. So optimistic liberals believe in the possibilities created by interdependence, institutions and pressure for democratisation. Optimistic realists in the China context believe that China's power will remain relatively limited and its aims contained, and play down the security dilemmas that its actions may create for other players. Optimistic constructivists believe that China's engagement in international institutions of various kinds will lead to shifts in its strategic culture and in the norms of international behaviour accepted by its leaders. On the other hand, pessimistic liberals see the Chinese leadership as struggling with political change, prone to hyper-nationalist assertiveness, and also see too much external pressure for democratisation and human rights as potentially counterproductive. Pessimistic realists see China's power as growing, its aims expanding, the security dilemma this poses as intense, and the need as a result for maintaining a strong competitive posture very strong. And pessimistic constructivists worry that an excessively competitive approach by the US in particular will result in a hardening of Chinese leadership mindsets, which is the key to everything else. Of course, given life's complexity and variability, any classification of human instincts or behaviour in starkly bipolar terms does run the risk of sliding into parody. I can't help remembering in this respect the solemn declaration by an Oxford philosophy tutor of mine long ago, absolutely incontestable as a matter of fact, but not extraordinarily helpful to anything in practice, his proposition that there are two kinds of people in the world: those who wear nightcaps to bed and those who don't. But I also can't help thinking, in the context of this bipolar sort of characterisation, as I look out on the world around us, and certainly at the way in which policymakers and decision makers address most of the public policy issues with which I've been concerned over my own professional life, including foreign policy, I can't help but think that there is something to be said for seeing the crucial difference in terms of optimism versus pessimism. There does seem to be a mindset which is basically open, embracing, inquisitive, adventurous, and positive, and another which is narrow, confined, cautious, negative. Most people do seem to line up instinctively or intuitively on one side of this line or the other. And when they're influential in policy making, it really does matter which side of the line that is. The crucial point I'll leave you with is that in foreign policy, as in life itself, outlooks can be self-reinforcing, self-fulfilling. Pessimists see conflict of one kind or another as more or less inevitable and adopt a highly wary and competitive approach to the conduct of international relations. But for optimists of all stripes and colours, what matters rather is believing in and nurturing the instinct of cooperation in the hope and the expectation that decent human values will ultimately prevail. And that's where I come out. If we want to change the world for the better, we must start by believing that this is possible. Thank you.